I was telling folks this afternoon, I actually co-teach a church in a Sunday school class in the church where I'm a member, which means I teach when I'm there because I'm out a lot of weekends working with churches. And we started this class 7.5 years ago, and then we called it the Empty Nesters class, because that was our primary age characteristic. Well, about 2 years ago, we had to change the name because people were beginning to retire in the class, and so we changed it to Friends and Followers. Now that so many people in our class are having hip replacements and knee replacements, we're thinking about either the replacements parts class or the bionic class. We can't decide which one it ought to be, but we figure it ought to be one of those. What do you think? But when you come to visit our church, they list the age category for our class as 45 and up, because we convinced these youngsters who are in their 40s to join our class. You know, they're in their late 40s now, and so that makes us be able to be 45 and up class. All right, you have at your place now, and I really appreciate the assistance I'm receiving tonight from folks, a copy of the Congregational Life Cycle. The Congregational Life Cycle, if you look down at the middle at the bottom, you see that it has 4 very interesting words that we've already dealt with: vision, relationships, programs, and management. Those 4 factors are the 4 organizing principles of this life cycle that goes from birth to infancy to childhood to adolescence to adulthood to maturity to emptiness to retirement to old age and to death. But you will notice, once you get to maturity, there's a dotted line going up at a 45-degree angle that symbolizes the ability of a congregation to spiral forward to a new partial life cycle if they, under God's leadership, redevelop or revitalize as a congregation. Now, this is not what would be called a deterministic life cycle. A deterministic life cycle would say, if you're born as a congregation, you're going to die as a congregation. That's not what it says. If you were born as a congregation, you are going to get to a point where you are on the aging side of the life cycle, and you have the opportunity to spiral forward to a new partial life cycle. At any given time, one of the stages of the life cycle is characteristic, or most characteristic, of a congregation on any given day. So remember, we're dealing with Friday, April the 24th, 2015. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to explain through the life cycle, and then we're going to give you a tally sheet at the end that's going to allow you to say, I think that tonight, this is the stage of the life cycle we're in. Now let me give you a couple of, at least one illustration. The oldest church that I've ever done this life cycle analysis with is now 360 to 365 years old. I worked with them about 20 to 25 years ago, and they picked right off of the life cycle where they were. And then they said, yeah, but it's spiral number 40 or 41. We don't know which one. You know, because you spiral through the life cycle multiple times. That church, and it's an interesting sidebar story, is the First Baptist Church of Charleston, South Carolina, which is the oldest Baptist church in the South. But it did not start in the South. You talk about relocation. First Baptist Church, Charleston, South Carolina, started in Kittery, Maine. And after several hard winters, economic downturn, and religious persecution, William Screven and a certain number of the families of that church in Kittery, Maine got on a boat and sailed south to Charleston, South Carolina, and reestablished themselves as the First Baptist Church of Charleston, South Carolina. And it happened that William Screven, the pastor, had some business interests in Charleston, so it wasn't just that they went there, you know, without an idea. However, there is an apocryphal story. The apocryphal story is that they got on the boat, started sailing south, and at every port of call, they would go on shore with this wooden instrument in their hand that was known 350 years ago or 60 years ago as a snow shovel. And they would say to the people in the fort, "What is this?" And as long as the people in the fort knew what it was, they would get back on the boat.
Amen, brother.
When they got to Charleston, nobody knew where it was, what it was, and they said, "This is where God has ordained for us to be." Yeah. Well, that's the apocryphal story, but it's better than the other one, I think. Now, if they can pick out which stage they're in, even though they were 340 to 45 years old at the time I worked with them, then you can pick out where you are, even though you're older than a first-generation congregation. So we're asking you, where does it feel like as you hear me explain the life cycle that you are today? So let me start with birth. Every congregation that is born generally is born out of a sense, somewhat clear, we hope crystal clear, of a vision that God has given them for life as a congregation. And so notice in birth that vision is capitalized and relation R, M, and P, R, P, and M are lowercase. What that means is that vision is driving and is fully awake, and relationship programs and management are in child carriers in the back seat. You know, they're present, but they're not yet fully developed and expressing themselves. About 6 months to 2 years after church is founded, it then moves into infancy. In infancy, relationships wakes up, grows up, and joins vision in the front seat. And you have more of the disciple-making process of the church being expressed at that time. In fact, in infancy, a church, in birth, a church does a lot of scrambling to get that core group together. In infancy, they more clearly define who they are. In fact, there's this invisible circle that's drawn in the air that kind of defines who's in and who's out of this church. So some of the people who swarm to be a part of this new church at the beginning, during infancy, swarm away because they say, "Nah, this isn't turning out to be the kind of church I thought it was going to be." In infancy is where they more clarify their doctrine, worship styles, and some other different things like that. When a congregation is about 5 to 6 years old, they move from infancy into childhood. And what happens here is that programs wakes up, takes over the navigation point seat in the front seat, and relationships moves back into the back seat and probably takes a nap. Because over the next 5 to 6 years during childhood, a congregation establishes the program, ministry, and activity framework that it's probably going to have for the whole first generation of its life as a congregation. When a congregation is about 10 to 12 years old, it moves from childhood into adolescence. And once again, relationships becomes dominant and moves into the navigation seat. Programs moves into the back seat behind it, but is alive and awake and working. Adolescence is the most chaotic time in the life and ministry of a congregation. You've had some adolescents in your household at some time, right? You know what I'm talking about? Okay. Chaotic means the simultaneous existence of chaos and order. You know, you're not quite sure which is happening at which time. In fact, when my children were 16 and 13 years old, my son's 16 and my daughter 13, they were the epitome of adolescent church. My son was tall, long arms, loved to play sports, but he was awkward. He couldn't figure out where to put those arms and feet and legs. So he played some sports, but he never was outstanding in any sport because he was awkward. A congregation in adolescence sometimes is awkward. A congregation in adolescence is also like my daughter was when she was 13. You know, we always said about Allison, if you don't like her emotional state, wait 5 minutes and it'll change. You know, 55 minutes and you see everything she's got to offer, you know? And so that's like a church in adolescence. It's high and low, you know, you can't quite get to equilibrium. And so what happens to a church in adolescence after several years of that, they say, you know, we got to provide some kind of order to this. So they start working more on their formal management. And so when a congregation is about 18 to 22 years old, they move from adolescence into adulthood for the first time. Adulthood is where vision, relationships, programs, and management are all alive, all fully developed, all working, all in the right seat in the automobile, and the car, the journey is humming. The synergy is there. The difficulty with adulthood, however, for congregations is that they aren't really sure what it's supposed to feel like when they arrive at adulthood. Now, let me give this illustration. Some of you have probably driven Interstate 85 from North Carolina through the northwest part of South Carolina on into Georgia. Any of you ever done that? Yep, most all of us have done it. You've seen the Peachoid in near Gaffney, which, by the way, trivia, that's Cherokee County, South Carolina. I worked for the South Carolina Baptist Convention for 14 years. I can tell you, on the rolls of the churches in Cherokee County, which there are 55 of them, there are more members of the 55 Baptist churches in Cherokee County than there is the population of Cherokee County. Now you remember that includes inactive members too, but on the rolls of those churches, that number is greater than the population of Cherokee County. Well, when you get into South Carolina, I don't know if you've ever noticed or not, but there's a State Route 11 as you're approaching Cherokee, which is kind of like the Cherokee Foothills Parkway. It's not exactly the right name. But it does this arc, and it goes up along the foothills of the Appalachian Mountains and then rejoins Interstate 85 at exit 1 right before you go into Georgia. Well, that road passes through what is known culturally in South Carolina as the Dark Corner. And the Dark Corner is defined by some Irish and Scottish people who settled there 200 plus years ago, who were anti-city, anti-government, anti-education, and anti-revenuers for some obvious reason. And up until about 20 or 25 years ago, when these mountain resort developments began to find land up there that they could buy and build, and there's a whole series of things called the cliffs of this and the cliffs of that, and other different resort things. If you would drive that State Route 11, and at many of the crossroads, there was a no-name convenience store. You know, the chain stores and the chain gas stations haven't found it yet. And if you go in into that store and ask the person behind the counter, "Hey, is this the Dark Corner?" "Nah, this ain't it." And you could stop at every one of them, and you know they would give you the same answer until finally you'd stop at one, and the person had the sense to ask you another question. Said, "Where are you coming from?" I said, "Well, I'm coming from North Carolina." I said, "You just missed it. It's 2 or 3 miles back up the road." You know? In other words, it's a concept, but you can't really find a place that is known as the Dark Corner. When a congregation reaches adulthood, if you ask them, "Is this adulthood? Is this where you were headed?" "Nah, this ain't it yet." And so what happens to a lot of congregations is what should be the best stage of their life they miss because they have expectations that they fantasize about that the congregation has never reached. And so what happens about 22 to 27 years after the founding of a congregation, in the middle of the night, without fanfare, they move from adulthood to maturity, and for the first time in their life, vision is not driving. Now, the maturity stage of the life cycle of the congregation is a high quality stage because the relationships and the programs and the management, now the management's driving, it's still fairly empowering, it's not really controlling. And if I were to put on your sheet, because I know it's in black and white, a green line that started at birth that characterized the quality of what's happening in that church, that line would still be going up in maturity. It's the highest quality time in the life and ministry of the church. but it's also the scratch your head time because you don't know why anymore, because you've lost vision. And so what happens in maturity is the congregation generally flattens out, doesn't have quite the same zeal and excitement that it had, but we can't exactly figure out what's going on. I don't know if you're familiar with this concept or not, but more than 55 years ago, a woman named Elizabeth Kubler-Ross wrote a book entitled Death and Dying, which talks about the stages of death and dying. The first stage of death and dying is denial. A congregation in maturity that for the first time is without vision is in denial that they're not what they used to be. Maturity is the first time you see the dotted lines going up at a 45-degree angle. But very few congregations revitalize or redevelop forward in the maturity stage because they deny that they're not what they once were. The only thing they're missing is clarity of vision. They're a good congregation. But if they don't work on that, they're going to be in trouble. So since they deny, they then move on to the next stage, which is known as empty nest. In the empty nest stage of the congregation, now programs, ministries, and activities, the P factor is diminishing. Visibly, attendance is down. The quality of the programs and ministries and activities aren't as good as they were. Finances aren't working like they were. Management is driving and getting more and more institutionalized and controlling. Relationships are still pretty good. We like one another. We work harder, not smarter. We're like the old commercials, if you're old enough to remember these. We're number 2, but we try harder, Avis rental cars. But it's not working for them at that point. If a congregation doesn't redevelop forward during the empty nest stage, they will then move on to the retirement stage. Now, as they're moving on to that, I want to give you a couple of characteristics. I want to back up here and give you a couple of characteristics. Do y'all remember you have to be probably my age or a little bit younger to remember this. Do you remember the Christian humorist named Grady Nutt? Who was on, not Hee Haw, but one of the Saturday night shows. But anyhow, Grady Nutt was a person I knew when I lived in Louisville, Kentucky. Super guy. Died in a private airplane crash in 1986. He had flown to Mississippi to do a gig, and he and the co-pilot took off, and the plane had not been refueled, and it crashed. And but Grady used to have this story, and so I'm going to dedicate this story to Grady, and it's going to be some rural story, because that's the story he used to tell, but I think it helps illustrate the point. Grady used to say, and things have changed now, he said, do you know how you count the attendance in the men's Bible class that meets under the old oak tree out in the gravel parking lot? You wait until they go in for worship and go out and count the cigarette butts and divide by 5. That's how you know how many people are present. Well, Harry and Dave are members of that man's Bible class. But they don't go in for worship. They're the self-appointed parking lot detail that walks around the parking lot, making sure nobody's trying to break into anybody's car, that no teenagers have snuck out of worship and gone behind the cinder block fellowship building and doing things they shouldn't do, like smoking cigarettes, and Harry and Dave keep smoking cigarettes. In the maturity stage, when the only thing missing is vision, Harry says to Dave one Sunday, Dave, something's not quite right in our church anymore. I don't know what it is, can't put my finger on it, but something that was here is not here anymore. And Dave says, Harry, I know what you're talking about, but I don't know what it is either. I get the same feeling. They're talking about vision. Fast forward 10 years later, they're walking around the parking lot. The church is in the empty nest stage of the church. Harry says to Dave, Dave, you remember a conversation we had some years ago about our church, something not being in our church, that used to be in our church, I didn't know what it was. And, yeah, I kind of remember that conversation. Well, Dave, I've got it figured out now. Well, it's about time. The problem with our church is we don't have any more of them youths around. Youths. Yeah, them teenagers, them youths. Dave looks at Harry and says, Harry, 10 years ago, how many teenagers did you have in your household? I said, I had 2. Well, I had 3. Dave, how many teenagers you got in your Harry, how many teenagers you got in your house today? Well, I don't have any. They're married. I got a couple grandkids. Yeah, me too. And Harry, since like attracts like, it looks like that to me that Maud and Margaret Ann aren't going to have any more kids. Then that's why we don't have any more than youths around. We're a different church now. Now let's go to Maud and Margaret Ann. Maud and Margaret Ann are best friends. And this is at the end of the empty nest stage. One day, they were eating a piece of leftover pecan pie and a cup of coffee, decaf, of course, in Margaret Ann's kitchen. And Maud turns to her and says, Margaret Ann, you're my best friend in the whole world. I know that, Maud. Margaret Ann, you and I talk about things as friends that we don't talk to Harry and Dave about. Yeah, I know that. Margaret Ann, we talk about things that we wouldn't dare mention in our Sunday school class, the Pathfinders, because, we just wouldn't mention it. Yeah, I know that. I know that, Paul. Margaret Ann, I've got to say one of those things to you right now. Say it, girl. Margaret Ann, our church is no longer a good place to invite people to come and be. But I wouldn't want our new appointed pastor to know that. I even said that. What happens at the end of Empty Nest is that the long-tenured members become at least a little melancholy to depressed about their church and the vitality of its future. And, in the situation, they're without a pastor when they move from empty nest to retirement, and a new pastor is going to be appointed to them, and they have that first visit. And because their church went through some controversy and the pastor had to be removed by the bishop, they have a congregational-wide meeting and not just the typical SPR meeting with the new pastor candidate. And so in the meeting, the SPR chairman is talking to the new person who potentially is going to come. The bishop is still a little unsure, and looks him in the face and says, "Come help us grow." Well, he was anxious to be appointed to your church. And so he kind of figured over, he goes, yes. And so he starts talking to them about contemporary worship, innovative ministry, new missional engagement kind of things out in the community, taking an international mission trip every year and all this kind of stuff. And their heads kind of going around like this, and they say, if you'll just let the bishop appoint him, we can beat those things out of him once he gets here. And so, because we've heard the tapes have been preaching, he's great. And so he comes, and he tries to do some of those things because he understood that's what they wanted. And about 18 to 36 months into the job, a member of the SBR who has the bishop's home phone number and his cell number calls the bishop, her, and says to her, "We need to get rid of this one too. When you appoint this spring, we don't want this one back." Retirement is a stage where congregations spin through that stage over and over again. About the time they try to do something new and innovative and creative that'll be long-lasting, that'll move them forward, they don't realize that in retirement, it takes 3 to 5 years to set a new direction and to sustain it. And their delayed gratification is 18 to 36 months. So about the time the stuff starts to work, they pull the choke chain, the invisible one that they put around the new pastor's neck, and say, quit it, or leave, or both, in terms of what's happening. In retirement, management is driving, programs are navigating, and relationships and vision are asleep in the back seat, where we ended up the car analogy up here in terms of what's going on. There are churches that go through the retirement stage, spin through it. It's like the Lexus Sports Utility Vehicle is an all-wheel drive vehicle. And it's like the wheels are a hub deep in mud, and all four of them are just spinning, but there is no traction. If a congregation doesn't spiral forward in retirement, they ultimately move to old age, where the only thing awake is management, and then ultimately they die. No congregation, remember this is not a deterministic life cycle, no congregation has to die. But the key factor is, once you get to the aging side of the life cycle, you're no longer driven by vision. And then some other complications begin to set in. If you do not see this as an opportunity and an open door that God gives you to spiral forward to a new partial life cycle. Now, one of the questions churches often ask me is, George, I think I get this. But what I'd really like to know is, how do I get up to the top of the life cycle to where adulthood and maturity is and stay there? Why do I have to start down the aging side? God's world is a dynamic world. It never stays the same. Congregations are dynamic congregations. They never stay the same. So there's going to be movement. So let me tell you the long-term solution. Unless you perceive you're in adulthood today, that you've got clear vision, clear relationship, clear programs, clear management, they're all in the right seat in the vehicle. The next time you hit adulthood, hardwire into the culture of the church that every 7 to 9 years, like taking a bath on Saturday night, whether you need to or not, you're going to revision where your church is headed. And then you'll find yourself going adulthood, maturity, adulthood, maturity, adulthood, maturity, adulthood, maturity. But that's hard to do, because if it's going well, we feel comfortable. And each time it reaches maturity, we say, oh, we're really all right. We deny that every 7 to 9 years after the first generation of life in the congregation, we must redream the dream of where God is in the process of leading us. Now, let me stop at this point. That's the life cycle. Those are the 10 stages. I went very quickly through old age and death because they were irrelevant to you. Okay? In case you didn't know that. I assume you knew that from the way I described it. But what I want you to do is to think about, without asking your neighbor, no, I want to back that up. This is the difference. You can talk about it for a couple of minutes at your table. Which stage do you think that we're in and why? But let me also, before we do that, Clara, we can start handing out the tally sheets, one for each table. I also want to open it up for questions. Do you understand the life cycle? Would you like to ask any questions about it before you pick one of the 10 stages? This makes sense to you. If it makes sense to you, hold up your hand. I get it. Okay? How many of you feel like I have a clear thought about what stage we might be in right now? Yeah, a little fewer. There is no true scientific issue to this, but it's one of the things we work with. Which stage most seems like where God is, where we are right now as a congregation is what we want you to say. There's a sheet coming around that has all 10 stages listed on it, and you were simply asked to put a tick mark in the stage where you think the congregation is tonight. And it doesn't have to be what anybody else at the table says. But let's focus on it this way. It is 7 minutes after 9. I would like to ask you to take at least 5 minutes at your table to think about it and to talk about it. And when you think you've got a decision, each individual person put their tick mark on the sheet. In other words, not just one tick mark for the table. Each individual person put their own tick mark on the sheet as the stage you choose. Once you have done that and you've handed to me your form, then we're finished for the night and you can start going home. But as you stand up, others will still be talking at their table, so you need to stand up quietly. Does that make sense? And if you want a copy of the book that talks about this whole process, if there are any left back there on the table, you're free to purchase those books. And if you need more, I can order more for you, that kind of thing. Questions, comments, or war stories? Anybody need showing you a war wounds before we dismiss? Okay. Yes, ma'am. You may, let me answer that question. There are two answers to that question. Yeah, well, my answer will tell you what the question was. Not every part of the church is at the same stage of the life cycle. If I were to ask you, where's the youth department? You might put one thing. Where's the Pathfinders? You might put another thing. And so different parts of the church can feel like they're at a different stage of the life cycle. What I'm asking you to do is to back up and say, when I think about our church as a whole, where do I think we are? Now, some people also, and this is really what the question was, haven't necessarily been here for 20 years to see the whole pattern. But yet, some of the characteristics that I named may feel to you like, well, that's what it feels like to me. So you should feel free to say, this is the stage that most feels like where we are right now as a congregation. And before we dismiss, Barbara has a ministry of announcements, which is the largest ministry in any church. How many announcements we make during the year?
Okay, when you all leave tonight, those who can, if you would please stack your chairs on the side, we would really appreciate that. And also, if, I think Ray announced earlier that we are paying for George's time with us through private donation. We are still collecting for that, and if anybody feels inclined to donate to it, we're going to have a box in the back. If you write a check, you need to put SSJ on the memo line. But, you know, you're not, no obligation, but it's just you're invited to if you so choose. And anybody that wants to help us break down tables too, that'll be great.
All right, and before you leave, be sure that I have your tally sheet from the second exercise and the tally sheet from this exercise. And so someone be sure to bring that up here to me. Thank you very much. God bless you. We'll start with the rest of the